goes again. Why won't you sit still?
He's playing a song, it looks like. That's part of it.
Just go ahead, Andrea.
Okay. My name's Andrea, and I'm going to be teaching on mostly Martin Luther, but we're also going to touch on other elements of the Protestant Reformation. I love this. This is one of my favorite periods of history in Europe, and I jumped at the opportunity and volunteered to teach this. I'm going to be referring to scripture, but I'm not going to be as heavily in scripture today as I normally am. So what I'd like to do before I jump into Luther is I just want to talk about some things that I think helped set the Reformation in place. Let's be very clear, Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation did not begin with Martin Luther. But he was the catalyst. He was the main catalyst of change. But there were reformers before him. And there were some things that were going on in European history at that time that really, I think, helped the Reformation take hold. From 1346 to 1353, you have the Black Death, or the plague, in Europe, which completely annihilated Western Europe, Asia, and North Africa. But especially in Europe, it killed between 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. The Black Death took out a total of 75 to 200 million people approximately in those areas that I just described, Europe, Asia, and North Africa. No one was immune to the Black Death. When it hit every class of medieval structure. It hit the serf, it hit the noble, it hit the church. It also set into motion this change of Europe from an agrarian society, mostly farm, mostly land-based, into more urban, because entire areas were wiped out with plague. And I mean, let's take, for example, if you have, a little plot of land, however much land it is, and you have all the serfs, and let's say the noble family is wiped out, and a few serfs are left, what are those people going to do? Are they going to stay with the land, or are they going to go to cities? You see a lot of migration into cities with this. That helps to change Europe. That will be the genesis of the middle class. Then, another thing that's taking place in Europe at this time, you have the Babylonian captivity and the Great Schism within the church, which roughly lasts. Most historians try to break up the Babylonian captivity and the Great Schism, but my Western Civ professor 20 plus years ago sort of put it all together, and I kind of like that. So you roughly we're looking at 1309 to 1417, when in 1309 a pope is elected from France. The Italians were not too happy with that. The French and Italian, there's no love lost there. They really don't need a whole lot of a reason to pick a fight with each other. They're really not happy with that. So the Pope, who is French, is basically denied access to the seat of papal authority in Rome, which is the throne of Peter. So he is basically in Babylonian captivity or exile in Avignon in France for 70 years. That's why they call it the Babylonian captivity. Because in the Old Testament, the Babylonian captivity was 70 years. This was roughly 70 years. Now, it takes 70 years for his papal authority to be established. Of course, by the time that happens, he's dead. At the same time, you have the Italian cardinals in Italy. They elect an Italian pope who's in Rome. So at one time, you have two men vying for control of papal authority in Rome, which had never happened. It was unprecedented. At the same time, this is when you also have the introduction of the Black Plague. And this starts a lot of people to question the legitimacy of papal authority and the necessity of papal authority to begin with. Because Europe at this time was very superstitious to some extent. One of the ways, if you had a grievance with someone, one of the ways to handle that grievance was to have trial by ordeal. And they believed that whoever survived the ordeal, that was the God's lawful, that was God's judgment, basically. This person is right, the other person who loses is wrong. Very superstitious. So you see these two popes. Then, at some point, after the death of the Pope in France, we have another Pope who tries to establish authority in Germany. I think it's either Germany or Bohemia. Bohemia is roughly the Czech Republic, the modern Czech Republic, I forget. But so at one time, 3 different men. At the same time that the Black Plague is just ravaging Europe. So you have these things sort of coming together to have people question not just papal authority, but church authority too. Because if we're looking at trial by ordeal, what does it say about the power of the Pope that this plague is menacing Europe and it's hitting everyone? It's not discriminating. That doesn't look very good. And so also at this time, you have so many, I could sit here and wax poetic for days on the grievances of the church, the fallacies of the Catholic Church at this time. You have the selling of indulgences. Basically, the selling, if you commit a sin and you've got enough money to pay for a little piece of paper called an indulgence, you can be free of the temporal, mortal, judgments for your sin. It's basically a get out of jail free card. That's what I think of it as. Now, it doesn't settle things between that person and God. They obviously have to stand before God, but it lets them basically get by with whatever they want to do. That is something that across the board in the church that you start to see outcries against that, which you have the beginnings of the Reformation. You have John Wycliffe in England who begins to translate the Bible into English from Jerome's Latin, which is tantamount to a death sentence. He has a very systematic way where he teaches his followers how to copy scripture. He also prepares them for the fact that they are going to be martyred. They're going to suffer for what they're doing because this is absolutely illegal. Wycliffe becomes a martyr to the cause. Inspired by Wycliffe, you have John Hus, who is also a reformer. He is in Bohemia, which, like I said just a minute ago, is roughly modern day the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia back at one time. He relies very heavily on the works of Wycliffe. He also is adamantly against the selling of indulgences and other grievances with the church. At the time of the Great Schism and the Babylonian captivity and all of that comes to fruition, you have something called the Council of Constance in roughly 1415 to 1417. You have that period where the papacy is trying to basically do some damage to what's happened with the Great Schism. They're trying to do propaganda control. One of the things, Hus is initially given a guarantee of safe conduct if he will appear in Rome before the Council of Constance. He goes in good faith. He goes and is later condemned and is burned to death at the stake.
Who is this?
Jan Hus. And it's interesting because when he is martyred in 1415, before, I don't know if it's his exact last words, but one of the last things he says before he's executed is, "You can cook this goose But 100 years from now, a swan will arise, and you will not be able to destroy it. That's kind of cool because Hus is punning on his name, because Hus in the Czech language means goose. And another interesting thing, one of the really great sources I just want to throw out there for a lot of really good information on Reformation is Dr. Erwin Lutzer. He is the pastor emeritus of the Moody Church, and he is a Reformation, I would call him a Reformation scholar. He knows a lot. He is like a wealth of information, so look him up. But he talks about that. He also has taken trips through the years to different places in Europe where you can go see where Hus is executed. Now, I said just a minute he was given safe conduct. I don't think the Council of Constance was in, I don't think that was in Rome. I think it was somewhere, it was probably somewhere in Bohemia now that I think about it. But anyway, sorry, my mind is whirling and swirling. Hus makes that proclamation. Lutzer says that he has stood in the room where Luther died. And on the table in that room, a swan is on the table. And it's interesting because he was executed 1415, 102 years later, 1517, on October 31st, that's when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, in Germany. So, and Luther would even call himself later a Hussite. Hus was somebody that when he started to make that break with the church, that was somebody that he really admired and really respected. Also, you have in this time before Luther, you have the invention of Johann Gutenberg's printing press, which will revolutionize, which will be a major, major, major thing to help the Reformation take hold. Because when Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of that church, they start printing it all over Germany. And Luther is a hero of the people in Germany. The people absolutely adore him. We'll get to that a little bit later. But that helps. That's one thing that helps the Reformation. Also, when Wycliffe's on trial before Hus, the Pope at one point takes 200 volumes that Wycliffe and his followers have painstakingly copied by hand. Spent hours, days, and months copying these testaments and other things by hand. Entire Bibles. Burns them. So you see, at this time in Europe, it's almost like changes in the air. You see it. You see a slow, progressive shift of power and of things that happen. And then you have Martin Luther, who was born in 1483. He's born in Germany. He's born, his mother and father, they were not, I won't say they didn't live in abject poverty, but they were a poor family. They weren't noble. They didn't have any major connections. They had many, didn't say how many kids they had, but Martin Luther had many brothers and sisters. He was a very gifted young man. And his father, apparently, whatever work he did was well off enough that when Luther came of age, for a while he studied at the University of Erfurt in law and was actually going to be a lawyer. And that was sort of his father's grand dream for this brilliant son of his, because he envisioned his son being this brilliant lawyer, having a wonderful career, and being able to help support the family. Well, Luther, at some point in his life, I didn't see anything where it pointed to a specific age, he has a thunderstorm. He's in this thunderstorm and sees lightning striking, he's hearing things, and is very shaken by it. And supposedly he says, "Saint Anne, if you will spare me, I will become a monk." So his life is spared in this storm. And he also says later that he believes God spoke to him in the thunder of that storm. So he leaves this promising career he has at the University of Erfurt and becomes a lowly Augustinian monk at the monastery in Erfurt, which absolutely devastates his father. His father is devastated, and there is a breach in their relationship for quite a while. Another thing that Dr. Lutzer pointed out that I thought was really cool, when the monks in Erfurt take their vows, they would get on the grave of a man called Johannes Zacharias, and he was one of the electors at the Council of Constance who voted to have Huss burned at the stake. Luther, as a young monk, kneels on the grave of one of the men who condemned Huss to death. That is just, I think that's kind of, wow. You can't make that up. Very interesting. Luther takes monastic life very seriously. He always tries to do more than what they're told to do. If they have to fast for 2 or 3 days, he fasts for a week. If they have to sit so many hours in prayer, let's say they have to sit 3 hours in prayer, he does 6 hours. He tries to do more. He also takes his role as friar and priest very seriously, because the priest is the one person in Catholic clergy who has the power by God in Mass to turn the wine and the bread into the blood and the flesh of Jesus. They have that power, or so they're taught that they have that power. He takes that very seriously, and there are records of him, feeling so overwhelmed at that power. It's almost more, he feels so unworthy of that, and he treats it with great reverence and great respect. So he does this for several years, and then an opportunity comes his way. An elector named Frederick asks Luther if he will be a professor at a little teeny tiny city in Germany, at a church, at the university there called Wittenberg. And Luther agrees. He goes. He's supposed to teach philosophy. It's really when he goes here that you really see Luther sort of starting to wrestle with and come to terms with some of the things that he's been taught his whole life, and that he's lived as a Catholic priest. He has a confessor named Staupitz, who he later says, had it not been for that confessor, he would have been in hell because of that. He would confess at times 6 hours a day. And the Catholic belief was that in order to be forgiven for sin, you had to confess your sin. Well, in order to confess your sin, you had to remember your sin. So if there was a sin that you forgot to mention that you didn't confess, you don't get forgiven for that, and that means that's either going to give you time in purgatory, or that puts you 1 foot closer to hell. So when Luther would go into confession to just sort of jog his memory, he would recite either the 10 Commandments or the 7 deadly sins, or both, and would spend 6 hours confessing every little sin. This was not a man who murdered, who committed adultery, who was fornicating, who was doing any major sin, any blasphemy. Well, he would go confess everything and then try to come back later after 6 hours straight of confession and be like, there's something I forgot. Well, this got to be a little bit more than Staupitz could bear, and he finally one day, just in frustration, said, Luther, quit wrangling with these little peccadillos. He said, commit adultery, commit murder, commit blasphemy, commit a great sin, then come back and confess that to Jesus, and then we'll talk about that. But Dr. Lutzer points out, and I think this is a good point, that Luther at this point was so ahead of his time in terms of being a theologian because he understood that the smallest sin was enough to get you into hell. It wasn't the size of the sin, it was the fact that you had sin to begin with. And he felt the weight of that. Now, I need to back up a little bit. In 1510, when he was still a priest in Erfurt, he and another monk were sent to Rome to vote on something, I forget, but they had to represent that monastery in Rome. So they walked from Germany to Rome. And he went to Rome expecting that Rome was going to be this great spiritual, it was going to be this spiritual, I don't know, the best word I can say, Luther wouldn't have thought of this, Mecca. Or he thought it was just going to be awesome. He was shocked and he was horrified. He went and said Mass in all of the places that you're supposed, all of the prescribed places that you're supposed to say Mass. But he was horrified by the selling of indulgences, which by this time was at an all-time high. Because the indulgences that Pope Leo X were selling, they needed to repair the dome, either build the dome or repair the dome. I can't remember which, but it's the dome for St. Peter's Basilica. So they were also not only selling indulgences for here, but you could, if you had family members who had died and were in purgatory, you could buy indulgences for them too and get them out of purgatory. He was horrified and shocked by that. He was absolutely just done in when he would go to Mass and would be in line to say the Mass, and he would have Italian priests rushing him, being very ardent, having absolutely no reverence or honor for what was taking place. He reportedly heard numerous priests say very sarcastically, "Blood thou art, wine thou art, and wine thou shalt be. Bread thou art, and bread thou shalt be." When they were right before communion, he was absolutely horrified by all of that. So when he goes to Wittenberg and becomes a professor of philosophy, he starts writing down all of these things, all of these grievances, all of these things that need to be corrected. Now, at this point, he isn't wanting to separate himself from the church. He's just wanting for the church to acknowledge that these things are wrong and they need to be done away with and they need to be corrected. So thus you have the 95 Theses. Most of those theses deal with the selling of indulgences. That is his biggest complaint. There are others too, but that's the biggest one. So when he, I don't know, I mean, I look on that date, October 31st, 1517. What was it like? Did the sun shine a little bit more brightly because Luther was getting ready to do this? Did maybe the grass appear a little greener because of what was going to... it was probably just an ordinary day, just any other day. But this day would change history forever because Luther would be the reformer. First of all, he wouldn't be martyred. He would live to tell the tale. But what he does, just, it sets off. It's almost like a domino effect. Or it's like, you know, you see in these old movies or westerns where people are trying to dynamite mountains or dynamite things. And they have like a series of charges set off. And then when they set the first charge, boom, one charge, boom, another charge, boom, another charge. And it just happens in order. That's what you have with Luther. So it takes a while for the church to respond to his 95 Theses. This is 1517, Reformation Day, October 31st. When I was a Baptist, my last Baptist preacher he refused to call it Halloween. He said, "Happy Reformation Day." I say it's Reformation Day. So, from 1517 to 1521, you have his theses are taken down. People read them. By then we have the Gutenberg press, like I mentioned before. They are copied in the press. They are made known throughout Europe, throughout Germany. Now, most of Europe can't stand Luther. They hate him. But the German, like I said before, the German people, he is a German folk hero to a lot of people. They love him. They absolutely adore him. This one lowly priest, this one lowly little friar who has no power, no money, nothing to speak of. Kind of like David going up against Goliath with just a little old slingshot and a few stones. That's really what Luther's doing. It's also kind of like, I think of him, as also kind of like Elijah. Going up on Mount Carmel, facing off against a nation, facing off against 850 priests of Baal. One man standing against a church, standing against a country, standing against a continent. That is, can't overemphasize that. So, in 1521, he is, first of all, the Pope tries to give him safe conduct to come to Rome and to talk about his beliefs and also in this time he's also writing. He's writing other things. He is writing on, he's making other beliefs known. Those are also circulated too. So by the time 1521 comes up, we've got the theses, plus he's also got quite a substantial body of work with his ideas floating around. By his own admission, one of the things that really helps him, come to the realization that you can't do enough good works to get into heaven, you can't say the Mass enough, you can't confess enough. He reads Galatians. That is where he really sees the imprint. God really imprints on his heart. Faith plus works equals nothing. The only way that we are justified and we are sanctified is by the blood of Jesus Christ and faith in him, and that is it. He reads that in Galatians, and then he sort of gets that confirmation when he reads Romans. And by the time he gets this offer from the Pope, come to Pope, we're going to give you safe conduct, we'll hear what you have to say. He's like, remember John Hus. He refused to go to Rome. He's like, yeah, I'm not doing that. I don't know. I almost think him saying, I may be some dumb lowly friar, but I'm not that dumb. Come on, guys. I'm not going to do that. So then, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, also the ruler of Germany at that time, which Germany was the seat of power for the Holy Roman Empire, issues a diet of Worms. Now, a diet is it's a high-class, up-class religious meeting where they're going to go, they're going to talk ideas, they're going to debate, they're going to do all of this. He gives him safe conduct to come to that. Now, Charles V was a very ardent Catholic, but Charles V is also not stupid either. He realizes that if he does anything to Luther, anarchy is going to break out all over Germany, because Luther is the people's hero. So he gives him safe conduct to go to Worms, spelled worms, but it's pronounced Worms. I think that's hilarious. A diet of worms. Ugh. Anyway, which he honors. He honors that word, that safe conduct. So Luther goes. When he gets there, it's packed. Anybody that, I think at one point it's standing room only, and it's over a series of days. It's not one meeting. It's like several days. I think it even was like several months. It was a very lengthy show. So he goes, and Charles V asks him if he's gonna renounce and recant all of these things he's written, all of these things he's believed in. Luther asks for a day. He wants to go, he wants to pray, he wants to wants to consider some things. He wants to, and I think also he probably wants to pray so that he can get God's wisdom, because he knows that whatever he says, this is important. So Charles V lets him have a day. He goes in prayer. Dr. Luther, not in this series, but I've heard him preach on another series, he talks about how Luther describes later how in his prayers how he felt, how closely and how strongly he felt the presence of God with him at that time. He had a really good friend who was basically telling him, be smart, Luther, recant. Just do it. He said, you have got, everybody is against you. And Luther famously said, but one man with God will always, or something to the effect, one man plus God is a majority. He wasn't backing down. So when he goes back the next day, which is even more packed, by that time you've got every single prince in the country of Germany, all of them are there to see this. This is the trial of the century. This is the moment. And Luther famously, he asked him, are you going to recant? Are you going to renounce everything you've written? And basically Luther says, I cannot violate my conscience. I believe that this is what God has given me. And if you ask me to renounce this, you are asking me to renounce Jesus Christ. I cannot go against my conscience, and he will not renounce Jesus Christ. So he refuses to renounce, which just sends shockwaves over everybody. I can't believe this one little, again, you cannot overemphasize this enough. Like David, like Elijah, the only power this man has is the spiritual authority that God has given him. He has nothing else to stand on. He has absolutely nothing. And when he did that, he wasn't just defying a king. He wasn't just defying a nation. He was defying a church. He was defying 1,000 years plus of church history and tradition. He was defying an entire continent who absolutely hated him, who were out for blood. And yet, this man did not waver. He did not quicken. He did not do anything. I think, if anything, his faith was probably more. He was resolved more strongly in his faith by that point.